minutes, okay. I'll have to be quick, so. Okay. 3 or 4 minutes won't really cover it, but if that's all you're going to give me, I'll do it.
I won't be too harsh on you, go on.
So anyway, they get a license in 2001 to emit a kilogram an hour, which they're pumping out 60,000 cubic meters of gas an hour. So what they effectively have is permission to emit waste gas at 17 milligrams per kilogram. The BATNEEC guidelines is 10. So they're allowed to exceed the recommended guidelines by 70% for 6 years, because they don't have to meet the guidelines until the 1st of January 2006. So 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have permission, they're given permission by the EPA to exceed the levels. The other 2 brick factories in the country, Fleming's Fireclays in Laois, had a limit set on them at the same time of 0.35 kilograms an hour. Our boys get 1, Fleming's get 0.35, King's Court Brick get 0.25. So Roadstone, Ormond Brick are given a very high emission rate and 5 years to come to the agreed standard. 2 kilns, 60,000 cubic meters an hour. In October 2001, they closed down Kiln 1. It's the dirtier of the 2 kilns. It's recorded in 2000 at knocking out 50 kilograms an hour. It's never going to meet the standard of 10. They close it down. They also say that it's a quiet time in the business and there's not a big demand for bricks. But they don't change the permitted emission of a kilogram. So 1 kiln that's now producing 33,000 is still allowed to pump out a kilogram. So the concentration, without breaking the license, has gone up to more than 30 milligrams per kilogram. That's a problem. That is the problem. When you say, where did the fluoride come from? That's where the fluoride came from, because for 5 years, operating 24 hours a day, they're pumping out that. Now, when they started doing the investigations, the factory asked, when they got the preliminary determination before the license was issued, they requested that the 2 things be upped, that the kilogram be upped and the 5 kilograms be upped. The 5 kilograms was up to 10, which is fair enough because the BATNEEC allows for 10. But they wanted the 1 kilogram pushed up. They weren't even happy with that. But the EPA replied to them and said, the potential ambient impact of this fluoride emission does not support permitting a discharge in excess of 1 kilogram. No scope exists for a higher discharge limit of hydrogen fluoride, even as a temporary expedient. Anything, it would, specifically as a maximum of 90, would exceed the TA Luft emission value. The TA Luft is the guideline value because there's no legislation regarding emissions, which maybe you guys should be looking into. So we use the German guidelines. But they state quite specifically that anything in excess of a kilo cannot happen. And that's in 2001 when they're talking about a kilo equals 17. By 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5, a kilo is equal to 30. So they are exceeding the emission levels, which would have an adverse effect on the environment. Moving on to where I want to cut this down. So that was it. That's our license. Now, the actual reality of it is that's the licensing, and then there's the enforcement and monitoring, which is a different outfit in the EPA. But the results of actual monitoring of emissions in the year 2000, like I say, the 2000 they were knocking out 50. 2001, 28, 2, 54, 3, 58, 4, 46, 5, 37, 6, 25, and 7, 27. Every year they were exceeding the limit. 17 was as much as you can put out without damaging the environment. They were knocking out consistently anything up to 50. The factory closed in 08 because they gave up. There was too much pressure, too many people asking too many questions. That's the fluoride. One other thing I have to talk about is the cadmium. I found the cadmium in the gutters. I grabbed samples out of the roof gutters of the factory, which is a very clever way of, or the farm, sorry, Dan's farm. And I found cadmium levels in it because the cadmium behaves like a gas. Particulate matter, PM10. You know what PM10 is? It's the stuff that comes out of a dirty diesel. PM 2.5 is the one we're all getting excited about now that's causing urban areas because it's a very small particle and it can get deep into your lungs. Cadmium adheres to particles of less than PM1, and that's from a EC report on cadmium. Cadmium is enriched in the fine particles mode or about or below 1 micron and consequently can penetrate deeply into the respiratory system and have a long residual time in the atmosphere. It actually says it has a cadmium emitted from the factory has a zero deposition velocity. And a zero deposition velocity means it just floats. Don't go anywhere. Doesn't go up, doesn't go down. And if occasionally it gets washed in the rain onto the roof of down sheds and collects in the gutters, and that's where I was finding it. And the boys, when I told the UCD people that I had found cadmium, back earlier in the story, I told them in 07 that I had found cadmium there in 04, so they included cadmium in their monitoring on the farm that they were doing all these weight trials and stuff that Dan was talking about. And they started getting cadmiums in the blood. In the blood at levels that are indicative of toxicity. Breakpoints for you, they were getting 80s and 100s and 200s. And this was at the start of the season. This was up until April. And then they were taking samples every month, May, June, July, August, September. 600 samples. All the blood samples that come off Dan's farm for 5 months were contaminated with cadmium in the IAS laboratories in Bagnallstown that were preparing the samples. The analysis was being done in Germany, but IAS were spinning them down and whatever before they sent them to Germany. Nobody ever explained how 600, and it's an approved laboratory for cadmium. They don't just keep it on the bench beside the sugar in the canteen. They know what cadmium is. And they managed to contaminate 600. And the processing of these samples occurred over a period of time. It wasn't just one point. It went on for, but it got diluted out. You could actually see the samples that were done one particular morning were clean. And from 11 o'clock on, they started picking up 6,000 parts of cadmium. And then the ones that were doing the next day, they were down to 4,000, and the next day 2,000, the next day 1,000, and 500, and 80, and 90, and they went away off like that. So there was one contamination event at the start, and then everything that went into it after that got slightly less contamination over time. But they managed to make it impossible to confirm that there was cadmium in the cattle. And even though there was some before and some after, the IAG people always maintained, oh, the samples were contaminated, we can't look at them, they don't mean anything. So we couldn't do anything but bloods. But we had kidneys, and cadmium accumulates in your kidney over time, whether you're a human or a cow. And 23 of Dan's cattle were analysed for cadmium in their kidneys. The legal maximum for food consumption in the EU is 1 part per million. We get up to 5 parts per million in old cows. They said it's unusual, but it's not killer. It doesn't prove anything because we get other cows in different parts of the country that have 5 parts of cadmium in them. And we have no national database with which to compare Dan's 23 cows. Subsequently, they did, as part of the European Food Safety Study, they took samples of 380 cattle at slaughter, different ages from 2 all the way up to 15 or 16. And they showed that there was the 2 graphs here. One graph is related to cadmium by age, and it shows that there's a 16-year-old cow, there's a 2-year-old cow, there's a straight line going up. And the slope of the line is 0.133, which means that every year you get older, your milligram per kilogram goes up by 0.133. They did Dan's cattle. Every year on Dan's farm, you went up by 0.25. Dan's cattle were accumulating kidney cadmium at twice the rate of the national average. Okay, that's fine. The other thing about the kidney cadmium from all the farms, they stratified them all across Ireland, and they got a strong linear relationship between the level of cadmium in the soil and the level of cadmium in the cows, which you're going to expect mostly through soil ingestion. It doesn't get into the grass, but when cattle are eating dirty, poached ground, up to 10% of their intake is actually soil. And ingestion is the main way of getting cadmium. So they got a nice predicted line that related their high cadmium kidneys were in farms that had high soil, 1.52, really high soil. This is up in Meath and North Kildare, near Tara Mines, which is the largest lead zinc mine in Europe. And lead, zinc and cadmium all go together, so you get geochemical pollution up there. So that whole area is rotten with cadmium. So we would expect that because Dan is here and beyond here, that Dan's soil cadmium concentration should be very high. They took 54 soil samples from Dan in 2007. And all 54 samples were below the level of detection of 0.1. There's 0.5, there's 1. All Dan's 54 samples were less than 0.1. They were off the Ficken scale, which indicates to me that the people that were taking those samples or analysing them didn't know what they were doing, because there was no way that 54 samples from Dan were less than the limited detection for cadmium. But it also means, we did it, we did a number ourselves, and it came out about 0.25, 0.35, which would be in the normal range for Kilkenny. But 0.25, 0.35 is still down the bottom of the graph. So Dan's cattle, there's no way the excess cadmium in the kidneys of Dan's cattle was got from the soil or the herbage. It was got by inhalation. They were breathing it in. Like I said, the average of that is 0.25. Dan had an 8-month-old calf that was never out of the house, that was killed and analysed in Kilkenny lab, and it was putting down cadmium at a rate of 0.75, 8 months old, never out of the house. Where was it getting 5 times the national average amount of cadmium? It was coming out of the chimney. They looked at the cadmium 3 times from the factory. The one time they looked at it, the first time they found that it was 180 times the TA Luft guidelines. 180 times more cadmium was coming out of the chimney than was permitted. They didn't report that. They didn't report that to any of the other agencies in the interagency group, any of the other researchers, the EPA. The EPA knew this in September 2004. Every report that was done in relation to DANS, and I'll just quickly tell you what they said. Veterinary Lab report of 06. Gaseous and particulate analysis were found to be below designated emission thresholds or below limits of detection, and thus further investigations with regard to animal health were not deemed necessary. That's important, because the EPA told the vets, don't bother looking for it, because we can't find it, and therefore it's not there, and then don't you waste your time. That was before I told Severa I had found it, and they started including it, and then the blood samples all got contaminated. That's in 06. In 08, they had an expert group, 5 international people, the UK and America. The EPA has commissioned a significant amount of monitoring the atmospheric emissions from Kiln 2. None of these substances were found to be present at significant concentrations in the emissions, which means that they give them all the data, this independent group that were to review the operation of the factory and the monitoring of the EPA. They weren't told the cadmium that was coming out in September 04, because they would have mentioned it. They didn't mention it. Final report of the agency group in 2010, oral petitions to Petty in 2012. One thing I got from Freedom of Information was an email from the EPA to Severa, and it says the cadmium emissions recorded in September were 0.24 grams per hour. Email from the EPA to the researchers in UCD. Cadmium emissions. The cadmium emissions recorded in run 1, the 15th of April 2004, were 0.24 kilograms per hour. They were not. They were 1,000 times higher. They reported grams instead of kilograms. And they stuck with that story right up until we produced the actual report from Scientifics. That's kilograms. And then they backtracked, and they did a modelling exercise to show that emissions from the factory at 200 times the TA Luft guidelines would still have no negative effect on Dan's farm. Dan's farm is 20 metres? 12 metres from the chimney. It's right across the road. Dan's farm starts and then goes up the hill. And they said that we modelled the emissions at 200 times. The actual observed thing was 180, and they said, to be sure, we'll go to 200. But they did dry deposition modelling. Dry deposition modelling is for that big PM10 stuff we were talking about. It doesn't travel to Dan's. You could have the dirtiest diesel engine in the world down in the factory. Dan's not going to smell the diesel. But when you're talking about PM1 and 0.1 and 0.5 with a 0 deposition velocity, and you get an inversion layer in a winter's day, and that's places operating 24 hours a day, that's going to get into the Dan's shed. It's going to get into Dan's calf, and it's going to cause it to get a shitload of cadmium and die from it. So cadmium and fluoride were both there in significant enough amounts to affect the animals. The final interagency report says no, wasn't.
Okay, Mr.
I'm finishing there because I'm only getting excited and I don't want to.
We have to suspend again because we have another vote, and when we come back, I'm going to go straight to questions on the members. Okay? Okay, we meeting suspended.